Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is great. This is a great turnout. This event is special for a few reasons. First of all, this is the second event put together by the Duke International Anti-Corruption Law Society and the Mexico National Business Attorneys Association, or the Asociación Nacional de Abogados de Empresa. Secondly, as is quickly becoming our tradition, we're streaming live to several cities around the world, and to friends of the law school, friends of the association, and friends of the Anti-Corruption Society in various cities, Paris, Santiago, Valencia, and Brasilia, just to name a few, and naturally to those cities in Mexico where the ANADE has presence, like Mexico City and Puebla, again, just to name a few. Finally, but not least importantly, we are especially enthusiastic about our speaker, who will be properly introduced to you in about 1 minute. I'd just like to remind you that the event will be divided into two portions. The first portion will be the lecture. It'll take about 45 minutes, and the second portion we'll devote to questions and answers. It'll take about the last 15 minutes of the event. And I'd like to remind you that if you're watching us online, you can submit your questions to the Society's Facebook page or Twitter account, which are displayed at the bottom of the screen. I now leave you with our own Professor Rachel Brewster.
Thank you very much. We still have people streaming in, which is a wonderful thing, right? So, and there's lots of seats in front. So as everyone comes in, just feel free to keep coming down to the front. No need to pile up in the back. All right, so it's my honor to present to you Dr. José Carlos Ugaz, who is an attorney and professor of law specializing in criminal and anti-corruption law, both in Peru and worldwide. He's currently the head of Transparency International. He's the chair of the international body. He's been an official and advisor on so many anti-corruption and human rights commissions that if I were to try and list them all here, it would lead no time for his lecture. So I'm simply going to have some highlights of his illustrious career. He has been the president of Protica, an organization of civil society fighting against corruption. He's been the ad hoc solicitor for the Republic of Peru in their prosecution of several criminal corruption cases, including the case against President Fujimori. He's been a consultant to the World Bank, in addition to being the head of integrity, the chair of integrity at the World Bank. In addition to this, he's been a member of several reform commissions, including the Administration of Justice in Peru, the Code of Criminal Procedure and Prison Policy in Peru. He's also been the Peruvian delegate to meetings of the Organization of American States having to do with their Convention Against Corruption. In addition, he is the co-author of the Act Against Torture for Brazil. And unsurprisingly, he has been listed as the most powerful lawyer in Brazil in 2002, and in 6 years he was listed among the top 5 most powerful lawyers in Peru. As I said, he's currently the chair of the international body for Transparency International. For those of you who don't know, let me introduce you to the non-governmental organization that is Transparency International. It was founded in 1993 in Berlin, Germany. And it's really been influential in the fight against anti-corruption. The treaty that you might know the best having to do with anti-corruption is the OECD Anti-Bribery Treaty, which really came about when members of the OECD decided to finally do something about not only domestic bribery, but foreign bribery. All right, so earlier some countries such as Germany used to not only didn't mind or didn't criminalize if their companies bribed overseas officials. They, in fact, subsidized it by offering a tax break. All you had to do was submit your receipt for the bribe. Transparency International was really key in turning public opinion against this approach. And I think that we can thank Transparency International for doing a lot of the groundwork in making European governments, and now a much broader group of governments, really care about the idea of corruption and not just see it as something as business as usual. In 1995, Transparency International developed the Corruption Perception Index, which ranks nations based on the perceived level of corruption within each nation. It's actually been quite effective in trying to get some nations to do something about domestic corruption, partly by embarrassing governments and partly by simply alerting businesses to the level of corruption that they might expect to receive. In 1999, they've also now introduced the Bribe Payers Index. So today, we are very lucky to have Dr. Ugaz with us, who will talk about corruption in international banking. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here and see so many young people in the audience. For us in Transparency International, youth is our bet, and we want to involve as much as possible young generations in the struggle against corruption. Okay. So Transparency International, just to let you know, I will not go of what already was said, is a global coalition. We are present in 117 countries through our national chapters. I personally was the head of Proética, that was a national chapter of Peru for some years, but we have different organizations in different parts of the world working on the anti-corruption agenda. We do research and analysis. As it was said, probably the most well-known instrument we have delivered to the world is the CPI, the Corruption Perception Index, that every year is upsetting the countries when they see that they are in a bad position in this picture. But we have many other instruments that we have delivered in order to measure or tackle issues of corruption. We have the Bribe Payers Index. We have TRACK, that is a report on transparency and accountability of multinational companies. We have the barometer on corruption and many other elements that are available there in order to work against corruption. We also work in developing resources. We have designed, for example, integrity packs, or what we call the national integrity systems assessment, in order to give the governments inputs on how can they resolve their issues of corruption. And we also are advocating for change and engaging and supporting citizens. Transparency International nowadays is going through a transitional process. There's been a change of leadership in last October, and there's a demand of our chapters to go into a more direct work on the field. In the past, we have been working in what we call critical engagement with the governments. Nowadays, with the issues of gross corruption or grand corruption, we believe that there are many cases in which there's no space to sit with the governments and talk. So our chapters and we as a global movement are taking a different approach to corruption. We want to be much more outspoken. We are starting naming and shaming and taking direct action when possible. For example, our chapter in France recently frozen 300 million euros that were in Paris in a French account at the name of Teodoro Obiang, the president of Equatorial Guinea, money that, of course, has been looted by him and his sons in the recent years. Our chapter in Russia is working against many kleptocrats and trying to take them to court, and the same things are happening in other countries around the world. Our chapter in Guatemala has been quite involved in the movement that brought down the president. Now the president of Guatemala is in prison, the vice president too, because they were caught as part of a fraudulent scheme that moved millions of dollars for their personal benefit. So now Transparency International is changing into a more militant and activist organization, and we have defined one of our priorities as the no impunity strategy. So we are working now in order to break impunity, because we believe that impunity is where corruption is breeded in most of the cases. And of course, banks have a lot to do with that, and we will talk about it in a moment. But before going into the issue of banks, these are the three strategies that we have defined for our 2020 work. We want to engage with the people. We are starting mobilizing people. Soon, in 2 weeks from now, probably you will hear TI is launching a worldwide contest. We want to make a beauty contest in order to select the 10 worst cases of corruption around the world. This will run through internet. We will have a list, I hope, with millions of voters. Anybody can present their candidates and vote. And once we have the list of the top 10, we will select the 3 first and start some direct action against them. That's on the umbrella of our no impunity strategy. We also want to have a stronger movement, and that's where I would like to invite you to be part of this international effort to struggle against corruption. We need to partner with the academia. Yesterday, I've been talking to someone of the George Washington Clinic. We are trying to work the linkage between human rights and corruption. One of the elements of grand corruption in these times is the impact of these actions in fundamental and basic human rights. So we believe that we can also go through the human rights system in order to address some of the issues of grand corruption we are seeing nowadays. And this is because the environment has changed. 23 years ago, when Transparency International was founded, we had a different type of corruption than the one we are seeing now every day. I would say that corruption we are experiencing in these times is a different animal from the one we've been dealing with in the past. And this has to do with several elements. We are living in a globalized world. There's much more money in the market now. Financial and technological tools make easier to move money from one place to another, to make much more sophisticated schemes to hide money and to make possible different types of crimes that have, of course, a corrupt vehicle in order to go through. The presence of organized crime and the huge resources that organized crime are moving in these times is one of the elements that have totally changed the nature of the corruption we are confronting in these times. The money of the drug cartels, the money of the people involved in illegal mining, in human trafficking, in weapon dealing is huge. If you go to YouTube and you see what happened some years ago in Mexico when the government tried to recover control of Michoacán, it looked like an external war. They had to mobilize ships, more than 6,000 troops to gain control of one state, and it was not possible. So we are talking about private armies and a lot of resources that are running through organized crime to different parts of the world. In the past, we had a different way of organization on the criminal groups. They, as you've seen in many films, the Italian type of mafia, it was a structure with a very stiff hierarchy, specialized. They were groups dealing with drugs, others with alcohol, others with illegal gaming or different type of activities. And they were regionally based. Now this has totally changed. We are talking not anymore about mafias. Of course, there are places where these traditional organizations still exist, but basically we are talking about criminal networks. And criminal networks are absolutely flexible, and they are not territorially based. And what is much more valued in this type of networks is if you have the capacity to provide. So today you can provide drugs, tomorrow you can provide humans, then you can provide contraband services or whatever is valued on the illegal market. So this has generated an absolutely change that had, of course, has an impact in the face of corruption. And that's why we are in an effort now in my organization to try to define grand corruption or gross corruption in order to define also a new strategy to address this type of phenomenon. We are basically talking of 3 elements when we talk about grand corruption. First of all, very powerful actors that have political and economical power. They mobilize huge amounts of resources. We will see some numbers immediately. And as I said before, this type of activity has a direct impact in basic fundamental rights. Most of the cases of corruption happen in countries of the third world on the south. And the impact that this has on the people is tremendous. Because corruption is not about only a moral issue, it's not only an economical problem. Corruption kills. When a building collapses in Bangladesh and more than 1,000 people die, it's because someone paid a bribe in order to build that building without the standards that were requested. When some congressmen in Sierra Leone are stealing the money from the Ebola fund, they are having a direct impact in the death of at least a part of the 11,000 people that died from Ebola in the recent times in this part of the world. And then we can account all the other consequences of corruption in education. Corruption deprives education of children, housing, health. So it's a problem that is really affecting the people, and that's why we are now trying to reinforce this linkage between this type of irregular practices or crimes with the consequences they are having to the people. And the worst of it is that it happens to the poorest of the poor. Who pays the bill of corruption are the poorest people in our countries. And we need to stop this. And this is about the things we are trying to do. One example of grand corruption, just to give you a flavor of what I'm trying to talk about, is the case of my country, Peru. And I know this case because I was in charge of taking it to court. To make short a quite long story, Alberto Fujimori was elected as president of Peru, Japanese descendant guy. He was not a well-known person in my country, and he ran against the most famous Peruvian in those days, Mario Vargas Llosa, who later on was awarded as a prize, a Nobel Literature Prize. Well, Fujimori defeated Vargas Llosa because of reasons that we will not discuss today. It's very complex to explain that. And he became the president of Peru without a party, without a program. Things like that, of course, happens in a country like mine and many other countries around the world. So when he was there, what he decided is to rely on the armed forces, and he brought Vladimiro Montesinos, who was a former military that was expelled of the armed forces because he was caught here in the United States selling military secrets to the American government in the Pentagon when Peru used to acquire its military infrastructure from the Soviet Union. So he was tried, he was convicted, he was not killed. He would have deserved death penalty, but some general there decided not to kill him, and then he studied law in prison, became a lawyer, and appeared many years after as the personal advisor of Alberto Fujimori. How did Fujimori and Montesinos meet? Because when Fujimori was running for president, someone discovered that he had forged some papers in order to present himself as a poor peasant to acquire free land from the government. The government had a program that delivered free land for poor peasants, and Fujimori presented himself as a poor peasant when he was the rector of the Agrarian University. That was quite an amazing story. This problem was putting in real danger his possibility of continuing the process of the elections, so someone presented Montesinos to him as a clever attorney. Montesinos was indeed a clever attorney. In the recent past, he had been the lawyer of the most relevant drug traffickers, Colombian and Peruvian, that were tried in Peru. And what Montesinos did, he just stole the file and disappeared all the evidence, and that made possible that Fujimori arrived as president. So when Fujimori was president, he brought him into office, and Montesinos was designated, appointed as the guy in charge of the intelligence service and, amazingly, of the struggle against drug trafficking. So you can imagine what happened with drug trafficking in those days. That's how Peru became, again, the first exporter of cocaine in the world. So Fujimori was elected in 1990. People were talking about human rights abuses and corruption 2 years after. Then he made a self-coup d'etat. He dissolved Congress. He dissolved the judiciary. He appointed judges directly. And there was a dictatorship in Peru for almost 1 year. But there was a lot of international pressure, so he called for new elections. He was reelected. there's a debate if it was fraud or not in this election, but then he was again re-elected, and it was a fraudulent election. So after more or less 10 years, he was trying to run for a third term, and that was too much. He modified the constitution to make it possible because it was forbidden, and the people went to the streets when something happened. A video appeared in TV, and Montesinos was in that video paying $15,000 to a recent elected member of Congress of the opposition in order to literally buy his vote. That was too much. There was a social unrest. Montesinos left the country. He flew to Panama, and then Fujimori started looking after Montesinos. And we didn't understand really why, because they were partners in this illegal business, and then we knew that Fujimori was looking for Montesinos because Montesinos had taped all the payments, illegal payments that he had done in the previous years. So when we intervened, we found 80 pieces of Samsonite luggage full of videos where Montesinos appeared paying different people, as I will mention in a minute. So Fujimori had no chance. He had to take Montesinos to the court, and that's where I appear. I was called by the Ministry of Justice. I was in the private practice, and he decided to ask me to go into this case. When we started the investigations, I and my team thought that we were going to confront a typical case of extended administrative corruption, as usual in countries like mine, Asia, or Africa, where you have corrupt leaders taking money from the state. But what we found once we started the investigation is this. We found a network that had taken absolute control of all the Peruvian structure. So this was a pyramidal organization. On the top of the pyramid, we had President Fujimori, his personal advisor, Montesinos, and the guy running the intelligence shop, and the general commander of the armed forces. NHR is Nicolás Hermosa Ríos. He was a general. He was also on the take with these other two. And then down, we had members of different institutions of the Peruvian state. This guy is Alipio Montes de Oca. He was the president of the Electoral Court, and he appears in a video receiving $10,000, and Montesinos saying that from then on, he will monthly receive additional $10,000 to his salary if he were to control and make possible all the re-elections of Fujimori and block the opposition. The other guy next to him is Alejandro Rodríguez Medrano. He was the de facto president of the Supreme Court, and he had an agreement with Montesinos in order to use the judicial system basically for three purposes. First, to grant impunity to the organization. Not even one case that was filed against someone of this group went through the Attorney General's office or the judicial system. Secondly, the judiciary was used as a Doberman of the regime. If you were opposing the government, they would immediately open you a criminal case and try to detain you. That's how the former president of the Constitutional Court had to request asylum. A broadcaster and some other opponents of the government had to leave the country because the judiciary was used for that purpose. And thirdly, it was also used for extortions. There were some cases where big amounts of money were on discussion before the courts. In those cases, Montesinos appeared through some of his representatives, and they requested money to assure that the case will be in favor of the payer. So they collected considerable millions of dollars through this means. The guy in the middle is Victor Hoyguay. He was the president of Congress, and he was in charge of recruiting the media. At that time in Peru, we had 9 channels of television. The 9 of them were under control of the government. 8 were paid, they were bought, and we had the videos when the owners of the TV channels appeared in the office of Montesinos receiving millions of dollars in cash, carrying them in bags, $3, $4, $5 million each time, in order to assure the editorial line of their channels to what the government was requesting. And he was also in charge of coordinating with other congressmen all the corrupt practices that went through the legislative power. This guy, the bald guy, is Alberto Venero. He was in charge of the financial structure of the organization, how money was taken abroad through offshore companies to safe havens in Grand Cayman, Panama, Liechtenstein, Switzerland, and other places. And finally, in the last block, we have the armed forces. The role of the armed forces in this case was to assure that the money from drug trafficking was flowing constantly into the organization. As I said, Peru is the first producer of cocaine. The regions where cocaine are produced are under military control by law, because they have been declared in emergency. So the militaries have the prerogative in these cases to decide who passes or not passes the drug. So they were charging money in order to allow all these drugs to go through the regions under their control. The other part of the task of the armed forces, or a group of the armed forces in this case, was related to human rights violations. There was a paramilitary group that was created, and again, grand corruption and abuses of human rights are frequently very tightly linked, and they started killing people that were opposed to the government, alleged terrorists in some cases, and finally, at the end, they started doing it as a private business. They charged money to torture or kill some of the enemies of private actors. So this is just to reflect how the entire system was under control of a criminal network. This is organized crime. This is not specific individuals taking money from the state. So the strategy had to be totally different. And just to go through this, we started 250 criminal proceedings against 1,500 people at the beginning. Then the numbers increased after the 5 years. I think there were more than 2,000 people criminally processed for this case. We recovered around $250 million from abroad, from different parts of the world, and around 150 of the top leaders of the country went into prison. Among them, 14 generals of the armed forces and the police that were detained one night after we discovered they're on a fraudulent scheme, receiving money from Montesinos. So this is the type of cases we are referring to when we talk about grand corruption or gross corruption. And just to have a sense of what is happening in all the regions, because this is not because we are Latins. I mean, we like salsa and we eat ceviche, but it is not that the reason why we have a lot of corruption. Corruption is everywhere. So I have some other examples. The China leaks have demonstrated that at least $150 billion, that means $150,000 million went out of China in 2011. And at least 20 members of the Chinese parliament have been proved to have $62.2 billion in the Bahamas in their private accounts. The former Prime Minister of China, Wen Jiabao, has $2.7 billion that had been taken after his administration of the Chinese government. I already talked about Teodoro Obiang. He and his sons are taking hundreds, if not billions of dollars from an oil producer country, and part of that has been already frozen in France. Martinelli, the former president of Panama, probably he's somewhere in the States. We believe he's in Miami. He allegedly has taken $5 billion during the 5 years he ruled his country. Yanukovych in Ukraine, $12 billion, and we can continue the list with this type of amounts of money. So this is huge, and this is mobilizing immense sizes of resources that could be invested in development, could be invested in health. You can imagine what we can do, or those countries could do with those amounts of money, instead of going for the private benefit of some individuals, to buy their yachts, their airplanes, their nice mansions, and things like that. Up to $32 trillion of private wealth is located in secrecy jurisdictions. So all these paradises where money goes through offshores. Then we will talk a little bit about offshores in a minute too. There is a global tax evasion calculated in $3 trillion a year, And the money leaving poor countries totalizes $6 trillion per year. So we are talking about huge flows of money going from poor countries to the private gain of some individuals. Now, we're going to talk about banks, and I just pull out some of the examples of what's happening with banks. We are not talking about little banks. We are not talking about Peruvian or Bangladeshi banks. We are talking about first world, huge banks, leaders in the financial sector. And then we have Hsbc, a bank located in the UK. $650 billion at least have gone to the Mexican cartels through the accounts of the Hsbc. They have been fined with $1.9 billion, and they have accepted the fine, and they have already paid. Hsbc was also partnering for this illegal business with Wachovia, also a big bank with many offices. Now I think it's going out of business, but Wachovia is linked to Wells Fargo, and you all know Wells Fargo. So we are talking again about a huge company in the financial sector. $378 billion. We are talking about billions, not anymore about millions. $378 billion went with Hsbc also to the drug trafficking sector. And it has been fined with $375 million. BNP Paribas, a French bank, it has laundered $190 billion to terrorist groups in Sudan, Libya, and other parts of the world. They have been fined with $8.9 billion that they have accepted to pay. Commerzbank in Germany, the second largest bank of Germany, $253 billion have gone through illicit flows by the accounts of this bank. It has been fined with $1.45 billion. Citigroup had its branch in Mexico, Banamex, and Banamex was laundering the money of the corrupt former president and former political leaders of Mexico, Salinas de Gortari and others. That's what they have been fined with $140 million. Citibank, the largest bank in the United States for many years. So we are talking about top institutions here. Bank of America is on an investigation also because of some linkages with the Mexican cartels. The Riggs Bank was found holding accounts of former dictator and criminal Pinochet, the former president and dictator of Chile. It also was holding money of British Airways Systems. There was a huge scandal of corruption linked to some Arab leaders, and it has also $2 billion from Equatorial Guinea that has been looted from the country by the Obiang family. This bank had been fined with $40 million. I think it's out of business now. And then some older cases. The Bcci Bank was found after a solid investigation laundering money for Saddam Hussein, for the cartel of Medellin, for Abu Nidal, that's a terrorist group acting in Palestine, and from Noriega, who has been convicted in this country, and he's paying a life-term sentence for drug trafficking. Recently, the Royal Bank of Canada has also been surprised in corrupt practices. So look at the amounts, look at the names, and you will see that we are talking about the top leader institutions in the financial sector. So the question is, what is the role of banks regarding corruption with this picture? When we talk about corruption in the financial sector, we are talking about basically about the abuse of public trust. These institutions have the trust of the public to hold our money and do business on our behalf. So there's a public trust in these type of institutions. But this public trust has been treasoned in order to obtain their personal gain and benefit them or some of their preferred clients, affecting society. So again, this is a social problem. We are not talking about only an economical issue or a moral problem, this has real impact in the people. And when corruption in the financial sector is linked to organized crime, as we've seen in this slide, then we are talking about an issue of national and international security. These banks are cooperating to finance terrorist groups. These banks are assuring that the drug cartels can move their money and enjoy the profits they do of crime. And as you know, terrorists and drug traffickers kill a lot of people around the world. So we are talking about international threats, organizations dealing with weapons, with humans, with different illegal assets. So corruption now is in the top of the agenda because it is threatening the world with this type of activities that are mobilizing huge amounts of resources from one place to another. One of the problems of gross or grand corruption, and we see this particularly in the case of the banks, is impunity. The corrupt usually go away with it without consequences. As you've seen, most of the banks I mentioned before have been fined, and they have paid their fines. But how many of the owners or the managers or the leaders of these banks who were involved in these corrupt practices are in prison? How many? Madoff, probably, and 4 bankers in Iceland. And then nothing else happened. And this is impunity. If you can write a check and forget about all the harm this generates to the world, then something wrong is happening here. And this is impunity, and that's why we are advocating for a change, a real structural change in the system. Of course, repression is not the solution of corruption, but repression is a component of a more sound anti-corruption comprehensive strategy. And if people see that the leaders of these institutions or the leaders of governments or rich people can do whatever they want and nothing happens, then this has a contagious effect. And that's why impunity is always breeding corruption to a higher scale. In the banking sector, all these scandals have gone through schemes of money laundering, tax evasion, rate rigging. There's this famous phrase of one guy responsible of rate rigging. And that demonstrates that he feels so confident about it that it's a usual and common practice around the world. And banks are accomplices of the corrupt because they hold their cash in their accounts, they move the money from one place to another, they make it difficult to trace, they hide the money many times through sophisticated financial structures, and they provide global access to stolen funds in different places so the corrupt can enjoy the proceeds of their crimes. According to Global Financial Integrity, a non-governmental organization, roughly $1 trillion flow illegally out of developing and emerging economies due to crime, corruption, and tax evasion. We said before, some other organizations talk about $2 trillion. So we are talking about huge amounts of money. And it is not about lack of rules. FATF and others have been putting in place different rules in order to control money laundering. Now you have to comply with several forms. You have to ask the people where the money is coming. You cannot move amounts over $10,000 if you don't declare the origin of the money and who will be the beneficiary, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is the banks are not accomplishing with all these rules of knowing your client, knowing your corporate partner, other banks in another worlds, knowing your employee, and all these. There are 40 rules against money laundering that have been put in place by FATF. But still, we're having all these huge problems. And once again, in the Fujimori's case, when the scandal of the videos appeared, suddenly we in the Peruvian government received a communication from the ambassador of Switzerland saying, coincidentally, we just found $45 million in 3 Swiss accounts at the name of Montesinos. Those accounts have been there for more than 8 years. And if it was not because of the scandal, I'm sure the Swiss will never would have reacted to this. And when I went to Switzerland and talked to the banker and said, what happened here? Why didn't you ask Montesinos where the money was coming from? And he said, well, we asked Montesinos and said, where are you bringing all these $45 million? And Montesinos said, well, I'm coming from a wealthy family in Peru. My family is in the fish flour business. And this, of course, generates a lot of money. Okay, great, bring me your cash. If that banker would have called his co-banker in Peru, and that's very easy, they do it 100 times a day when they are talking about ordinary people like you and me probably, he would have heard a plop in the other side of the line if he would have asked, do you know someone called Vladimiro Montesinos? Everybody in Peru knew what this guy was doing. But they decided to take the $45 million, despite the FATF rules. Of course, those 3 banks have never been sanctioned, even with fines, by the financial sector. So it is not only about rules, it is about enforcement. And then we as civil society, I think, even though this is a very critical issue because the financial sector is so specialized and has so many sophisticated ways of moving money and structuring schemes, it is not easy for civil society to monitor. But we are really willing to get into this and bring other experts with us in order to address the supervising, the social control of what is going with corrupt monies around the world. So to finish, what do we think we should do as a civil society organization, a global, I would say the leader organization on anti-corruption around the world? We think that large fines are not enough. First of all, on the repression side, individuals have to pay and they have to go to prison. And they have to serve and they have to return the money to the victims. Part of the problem with corruption is that victims are not always known. But worst, most of the victims don't even are conscious that they are victims. I was seeing a report in my country some months ago before some regional elections, and a very poor woman was asked by a journalist, so what do you think of the election of this guy who has all these records on corruption? And I said, I really don't care. I'm too poor to care about corruption. I don't pay taxes. I don't have a house. I don't have money. I don't have a bank account. So the corrupt are just affecting the people with wealth. Well, this poor woman was not conscious that she's the number one victim and that she is in that situation because someone is taking the money that she deserves to have a better condition of life. So ending impunity for us is one of our priorities. Of course, we want to work, and we are working at the preventive side. We are talking to some leading banks and trying to sit them in a table and discuss these issues and see, well, come on, be serious and try to give us alternatives to go out of this situation. And then it has to do, of course, with the incentives. Where are the incentives located in the financial sector? Basically, to push the money out of the bank in order to later collect the revenues of that money. But incentive is not located in the performance of the employees and other officials of the bank. So there has to be a system that creates a new, different culture in the finance sector in order to put the incentives on the right side. And the incentive of the right side is performance, is integrity, is transparency, not moving dirty money in order to make richer some of these corrupt actors around the world. Settlements, and this is my last idea. This is a country, the United States, and you know this as law-trained people, where settlements are one of the most common ways of finishing a legal conflict. So lawyers file big cases, and they are expecting all the time to sit in a table and arrive to an agreement. I don't know the percentages, but I would say that most of the important cases in this country are resolved by settlements. And settlements have proved that are not an adequate solution for corruption in the financial sector. And this is just because the bankers are taking the money from the banks, not even their own money. It's not money that gets out of their pocket. It's money that gets out of the institution that holds money of third parties. They pay and they continue. They move to another industry, or they just continue this, washing a little bit the face of the institution. There are companies that have proven that are recurrent in committing this type of crimes. Recently, Siemens has been caught again in a corrupt practice in a South American country after they had to pay a fine through a settlement of more than $1.5 billion. So settlements are not the way to solve this. Of course, we want to collect money in order to return that money to the people, but we want to deter this type of actions, and one of the best ways of deter this is making individuals responsible for the acts they commit. And these are very severe crimes. These crimes are having, as I said several times, real impact on the daily lives of the people. Finally, a last word on offshore companies. A recent report of the OECD, released in December, after an investigation of 450 cases of corruption, has proved that most of these cases of international bribery happen through corporate vehicles. So we have all these anonymous companies where we don't know who is the ultimate beneficiary. Usually the one that puts the face is an employee of a law firm that charges $500 and give you the corporate structure with his employees on the front of the company. And most of the dirty money and corrupt proceeds move through these corporate vehicles. So we want to know who are the ultimate beneficiaries of the offshore companies. We are advocating for a global registry in which anyone can have access and know who is behind a specific business. We have taken this to the G20. We have been successful. Also in December, the G20 has adopted the principles we have presented, and we will expect to see in the near future some development on these registries. Currently, Denmark, Norway, and the UK have already passed laws in order to regulate this type of situations. So this is something that we believe that can really make a difference in the environment of corruption. So I would stay here due to the time constraints, and once again, I invite you to get in touch with us. We are happy to open our doors to all of those of you who are willing to accompany us in this adventure of struggling against corruption. Thank you.
If anybody has a question for Dr. Ugaz, now would be a good time.
First, I want to start by thanking Dr. Ugaz for such a fantastic lecture. My question has, well, I completely agree on your point about greater enforcement, both in terms of financial sanctioning, but also in terms of getting people, the managers in charge, incarcerated. It seems like another major piece that you mentioned is the social aspect, which is we have to make bankers believe that this isn't just business as usual, right? That this, for a long time, particularly the senior managers now, this was the business model that they, to some extent, grew up with professionally. So how is it, do you think that in addition to kind of what governments can do in enforcement, how can we kind of as a civil society, try and really change the social strategy such that this is just no longer considered an acceptable mechanism. It isn't something you pay the fine and move on, but it is something that bankers don't even think about the fines because it's just not something they would consider doing. And how do we start to make strides towards that?
So I'll better take 2 or 3 questions. How much time do we have?
About 10 minutes.
10 minutes. So maybe I can have 4 or 5 questions and then. Yes.
What are some of the jurisdictional issues you get into when you're dealing with multilateral corporations that may have different home bases in multiple countries? So, like, let's say a country like France, a Western country, and then a developing country also, like Nigeria, something like that.
Yes.
I'm from Transnistria, where bribes are an essential part of business. So how would you advise a company working in a third world, in a developing area, where you must pay a bribe for the privilege of doing business, and if you don't, your competitor will?
So about your organization's policy on making public the beneficial owners of corporations. I'm from Colombia, and there is much concern when when you make public what the companies that people have, there might be a risk of danger, maybe being kidnapped in countries like mine because of the money they have. So they're concerned with these security issues when revealing beneficial owners. Has this been a concern that has been considered by your organization?
Yes.
And my question is on looking at corruption as a human rights issue. You mentioned the negative impacts on human rights. And I know I'm familiar from Transparency Ireland, for example, they do not use a language of human rights. And I would see a role for civil society working on anti-corruption issues to adopt the language of human rights and the principles of human rights and engage with states on that level, for example, with the movement towards states becoming more progressive in the field of business and human rights and adopting national plans. And is that something that you feel that, or is Transparency International doing more in relation to that? And most of what you spoke on, none of the strategies you outlined at the end with regards to enforcement really reads that or use the language around human rights.
Thank you. Okay. How to change the bank culture from civil society? That's a difficult one. What we are thinking to implement is when things don't happen because justice is not delivering and the systems are not working, then we should explore social sanctioning. And social sanctioning in these cases could imply, for example, a boycott to a bank. I don't want to have my money in a bank that is giving money to terrorists. I don't want to put my savings in a bank that is in the drug business, that are killing people next to me. So this is something we expect to see in our movement. We are in the middle of this debate right now, so I'm not assuring this is going to happen, but I would very much like to see that. On the other hand, we are trying to maintain a constructive approach talking to the banks. But we have done this several times in the past. We had this group with leading banks 3 years ago, and at the end, our perception was that they were trying to play with us and say, okay, let's sit here and talk, and nothing happened. And then all these big cases continue appearing. So, as usual, as it has been the tradition in Transparency International, preventive and constructive and positive engagement with institutions to try to do this better, and talking to regulators and see how much regulators can provide to this situation. But we also are civil society, and we represent at least part of the people of our countries, and we think we are entitled to take direct action and see what happens. Of course, this is very risky in the sense that we will have legal threats and others. Banks are very powerful, of course, and they will fight back, but that's something we are seriously considering to do in the near future. When you have different jurisdictions in a corruption case or a money laundering issue, well, now there are several rules that allow to make joint investigations and mutual cooperation. The UNCAC, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption, and other regional treaties allow countries to make this type of joint efforts. In the Peruvian case, as a matter of fact, we were able to bring expatriated people, extradited people. We were able to bring money, and we were able to bring proofs from different jurisdictions due to these provisions of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. There's out there a big debate right now if, and we went through these discussions too some years ago, if grand corruption or gross corruption should be added to Article 7 of the Statute of Rome that is there for crimes against humanity. We think that is not feasible. Is it possible to think on global jurisdiction to be applied like happened with some crimes against humanity or human rights? We also think that is not, at least in the mid-term, going to be a reality. So we believe it's better to deal with the rules we have in place already for corruption, and there are several rules there that we can take advantage of. Right now, there's an American judge, Judge Wolf from Boston, that is advocating for the creation of an international criminal court against corruption. He's very enthusiastic about it, and some people are supporting him. We love the idea, but again, I think it's not too realistic. At least we are not going to devote our efforts on that. You imagine all these crook governments signing a treaty that will hand them. It's going to be very difficult to assume. But there are different voices on the anti-corruption community trying to find better ways to deal with different jurisdictions and how to be more efficient. The situation of the third world, corrupt environments, and companies doing business in corrupt environments. There's always a way out. I'm Peruvian. I've been living in my country and other countries of the region for many years. I've investigated cases of corruption from the World Bank in Africa, and I can tell you there's always a way to go out of corruption. But the problem is many companies likes to go through the easy way, and the easy way is paying the bribe and then including it in the cost of the service or the project or whatever. So you can find allies, investigative journalists. There are always good investigative journalists in many of our countries. Other companies or sector associations or some honest official in the government. There are many ways of avoiding to pay a bribe in the third world. It is very strange a situation, I would say, when the only way to go through and not get out of business is paying a bribe. It could be in an extreme situation, and then, well, the company has to take its decision. But I would say, from my experience in the world, it is always there are always ways to avoid this type of illegal payments. Regarding beneficial ownership and security in countries like Colombia or Peru or Central America or Eastern Europe even, being rich has a cost. And the cost of being rich is that you need to be careful and you have to pay for your security. But I don't really think that this is the argument why people use offshore companies. People use offshore companies to evade taxes, to move illegal money. In some cases, privacy is a good thing. But you know that if you had an organized crime group that wills to abduct something, they always have a way to know who is who and where is the money. So, probably this will generate a big debate about the impact of opening the ultimate beneficiaries in the commercial dynamic of private business. But I think that the cost we are paying in order to accelerate some businesses and protect some people is too high with the harm these type of organizations or companies are generating. So I think that people have to take care of themselves by other means and not with these means that are generating serious corrupt impact around the world. And finally, on human rights, that is something we are really intending to move forward in these times. We are talking to some people on the human rights sector with human rights organizations. We already talked to Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International. We've met with them, and we are exploring all the possibilities in order to put corruption as one driver of impact and limitations and affecting human rights around the world. But this is quite new for us. We've not been doing this in the past. So probably if you invite me next year, I will tell you something different. Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I hope you enjoyed it.